Welcome to L&D Disrupt, the podcast dedicated to helping you overcome workplace challenges and prepare for the future of work today. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be speaking with the movers, shakers, and path breakers in L&D who are reshaping their organizations right now. Join us each week as we delve into the highs and lows of work in the industry to get to the real nitty-gritty stuff that you actually care about. A phrase that I always hear getting thrown around in the L&D space is putting the learner first. But I often wonder how many people proactively design a strategy to meet the employee's needs. Today, we're joined by someone who's super passionate about designing learning experiences that are intentionally built with the learner in mind. Sarah Stevenson, Vice President, Learning and Employee Experience at Schlesinger Group, is on the show to chat about how design thinking has impacted her work for the better, how you can use the principles to create some real change. Without further ado, here's Sarah. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hey, Nelson, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm super excited because we're going to kind of dive in and really dissect and break down really how we can use design thinking in L&D. But before we kind of dive in there, I wanted to kind of backtrack. And when did you first come across design thinking? It's one of those terms that seems like it's been around forever, but when did you kind of first really come across it?
Well, it comes out of a practice. I mean, we can go into like art history here and go into the Bauhaus and all of that, but it really evolves out of a space that was called human-centered design, right? That really emerged in the late 60s and to the 70s, which really evolved things like ergonomics, right? Like your OXO, potato peeler, human-centered design, right? So it didn't take too long for software developers really to adopt some of these, design practices into user experience, user interface practices. So I think it kind of design thinking as we see it today really formally came out of that software development process. I have a very, aligned story to that, as in, back in years and years and years ago, started in interface design with some software developers who were, designing things with Comic Sans and big red buttons because that's what you could do. So I have a very personal story that evolves with design thinking, but yeah, I think that practice is human-centered design is probably where we first encountered it and where I first encountered it.
And I guess for you, at what moment did you start thinking, actually, you could use design thinking in L&D? How did that come about?
Yeah, ironically, it was teaching developers design thinking.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I was like, oh, well, I'm already kind of doing this. Like, this is like putting words to a practice that I'm already doing, because I think that, I came out of a strict ADDIE principle and taught ADDIE for years, essentially. And then when SAMS came on the scene, with Allen Interactions, I was working with Allen Interactions they were, consultants for me at the time, and saw that kind of evolving into the space. And it was hard. I mean, SAMS is what design thinking is kind of too, right? It's sort of like a rapid prototyping model for learning, but it never caught on, I think, just because people didn't get the words and the practice of it. But, design thinking, I think, is what we have evolved a lot of ADDIE principles into over the past 10 years with, meeting the needs of business.
And just for our listeners who might not be familiar with the term, so what is, I guess, the core difference between ADDIE and SAMS as an approach goes?
Yeah, I think so. ADDIE has essentially a longer development model. So you're going through steps very consecutively, and then at the end, evaluating it. And both with SAMS as well as design thinking, you're kind of getting to a minimal viable product, listening to feedback and iterating, right? So it's a more iterative model in a much shorter development cycle as well.
And I guess just from what you've said there, Sarah, one of the aspects for why you might shift is quite obvious. The fact that you're realizing whether something works or not quite later on down the line with ADDIE, because you go through all the steps and then, months later, you might find out when you evaluate it actually made no difference or no one really engaged, versus with a more kind of MVP iterative approach, you're finding out a lot earlier. Were there anything else, any other challenges you were facing with ADDIE that made you kind of more open to newer ways of doing things?
Yeah, I think that, in the instructional design space, I think if you put together like 20 instructional designers in a room, we were like, what's your biggest problem? And they'd be like, SMEs. Right? Like getting feedback from subject matter experts, right? So you have one person that you're assigned as your subject matter expert, right? You're waiting, and they have a whole job that has nothing to do with your job, right? They're right. You're in many ways an impediment on their getting work done. And so in strict ADDIE, you're doing your analysis, you're doing your design, and then you're getting SME feedback, and you're getting SME feedback at every part of this step. Well, that's, if you only have one subject matter expert, your process is shifting incredibly, right? So from the L&D space, I think that, crowdsourcing, like I crowdsource now, right? So I go to the learners as my experts, right? Like what problems am I solving for them, not the one subject matter expert that I might have in the process. So, I have to say I rely more on documentation and reading through process manuals and reading through workflows for that subject matter expertise more than I rely on the subject matter expert at this point sometimes.
And so how did you start applying design thinking to the way you were developing your L&D strategy and content, etc.? How were you going about that?
Yeah, I'm at a new organization as of July, and they are really going through a huge evolution, and I think that this has been a great incubator to really try things, right? They're hungry for trying new things and new innovations. Previous to this, I think that I've done it in a far more quiet way, right? I think I've been doing this for 8 or 10 years and saying I think for a long time, and people who know me have heard this, I don't really believe in ADDIE. I believe in ADDIE, like where the E wraps around to the A. Yeah. And I think that, I've been doing it for a long time, but in the current state where I am and really driving things strategically, I don't have time to measure things in 9 months. I need to measure things in 5 and 6 week sprints.
Right.
And ADDIE doesn't make that possible. So design thinking methodology and that iterative methodology, and again, starting with that crowdsourcing, like what are the problems that we really need to solve? Is it a learning problem? Is it a communication problem? Is it a process problem? Is it a software problem? And being consultative right there at the beginning, I think lends to the space that I'm in. I think the space that we're all trying to solve business problems right now.
Right. And that kind of crowdsourcing part, Sarah, is that having a lot of chats and a lot of coffees with people? Is that sending out survey? How does that actually look?
All of those. So I started with what I call the listening tour. So really going to all of the senior executives, and then starting at the top layer of the organization, and then going to the bottom layer of the organization, really talking to people everywhere across the organization to see what they needed. Listening tours, and then listening systems like pulse surveys and exit surveys are extremely important. If your organization's not doing an exit survey, you're really missing out on the most honest feedback you could possibly get, right? And 90-day onboarding surveys are great too, when people are still in the honeymoon period and they give you great feedback and make you feel like you're really knocking it out of the park and what you should keep doing better, right? Yeah. So lots of pulse surveys, but I think that, that crowdsourcing piece is also looking at personas, like looking at personas within each different part of your organization where you might be having learning problems, right?
Right.
And really in that, design thinking model, number one is empathy, right? Number one, empathy.
Right.
So really trying to get to the people, did a great survey. This is, I just brought a group to Savannah a few weeks ago and did a whole learner persona survey and found out that the one role in the organization, everybody had a dog.
Right.
Nobody knew that, right? But, asked about their family and what their home looks like. And there's one role, everybody had a dog. So, when we created the persona, it wasn't just the persona of the person, it was the persona of the woman and her dog, Biscuit. They named the dog before the person, by the way, too. So
crowdsourcing, I love the idea, by the way, of listening tours. Like, Sarah's on a listening tour, and amazing. You crowdsource your ideas. You've kind of identified through that process of kind of problems, and let's say business problems for the time being. What happens with that information afterwards?
Yeah, that's great. So I go through a process that, often we do like a rosebud thorn exercise, right? So like, what are we doing well? Where do we have to improve, and what should we basically scrap, right? Or what's getting in our way of getting to the good and the opportunity. And that process within a group, I think, is really effective to then say, okay, well, this is really not a learning problem, right? Like, this is an opportunity to grow the organization, but really fundamentally, it's a leadership problem.
Right.
And then say, okay, well, it sounds like this is a communication problem between this group and this group. So when we get down to it, we're like, okay, we've boiled this all down and looked at this as a process and say, okay, well, these are the learning choices we need to make to create opportunity for the organization. So I think that, again, in that design thinking model, we have a very unique way of being able to say, okay, we understand what's going on organizationally, and we see the business problems that we keep encountering. And it's really easy for a lot of people to say, oh, it's a learning problem. Like we hear that.
Yeah.
Right. Like, oh, train people on this, right? Yeah. And that will magic, like I have some magic wand, oh, we've solved the learning problem, right? No, that's not how it works. So, I think that there are lots of different processes and methodologies that align with, design thinking. There's a great program at Luma Institute where they, have like a card, brought my cards for the YouTube viewers here. But, it's called Innovating for People, but it's a card sort where you can be like, okay, let's try this exercise and this exercise and this exercise. And if we put these things together, then we'll probably get to a point where we understand where we need to go.
And who's involved in that discussion, Sarah? Like, who else do you bring in when you're discussing, is this a leadership problem, communication problem, learning problem? Who's involved in that?
That's a great question, Nelson. I mean, as many people as I can get involved, frankly, right? So stakeholders are important, whether they're part of that broader conversation or in that listening phase. The director, VP director level, the people who are, strategically moving the needle in the organization are important to get involved in that conversation because they have frankly, different things that they're aiming for, right, than maybe the learners themselves. Bringing the learner into the conversation, if nothing else, through, modeling and creating personas, bringing them into that conversation so you can point to the persona on the wall and say, well, how would Natalie solve this problem? Yeah. But it's also bringing in your learning consultants, right? I think that we, as learning consultants, have a really important role within organizations to help solve business problems.
Yeah. And what does the format of one of those sessions look like, Sarah? Is it like you're up on the whiteboard, sticking Post-its and getting everyone involved? Or is it kind of presenting back the data you've gathered from the crowdsourcing? What does it typically look like?
It can be both. I mean, I've gone through and walked, I do a number of some consulting work, and I've gone through virtually this process too with something like a Miro board or a Tableau board, where you're asking questions, trying to get as much information from the people in the room and the subject matter experts. And then, yeah, presenting out sometimes the data that might surprise them, right? The pre-work of those sessions,
Right.
Which is always it's usually rather enlightening to present back people, the people that they work with every day in an anonymized way, giving their feedback.
You've kind of landed on the fact that it's a learning problem, and now you're trying to solutionize. And you'd mentioned earlier around more of an MVP approach. So what does that look like? How do you go from we've defined our problem to the MVP? How do you get to that point?
Yeah, one of the things that I had on my notes to chat with you about is I think that, yes, we might not be formally saying design thinking, right? But I think that our development products, like our rapid development tools, have matched well with creating things in that MVP process. So we look at tools like Articulate Rise, which is, I can show you how to use Articulate Rise in about an hour, top to bottom, and I'm not saying that you're going to be a great content developer, but you can certainly put your content into a format that's mobile and palatable and easily, sent out into the world and distributed into the world. So I think that, when we look at the rapid development model or the MVP model, we're looking to get to the goals, right? So in a traditional model, we're saying, okay, well, tell me what, the consultation is not, hey, what business problem are we solving? Hey, what are the learner's needs? Traditionally, it's what are your 3 objectives?
Yeah.
Right. So I think that rapid development looks a lot different, and it's not absent the 3 objectives, to be completely clear. I think that still is a viable way to get to the from the start to the finish. But I think that rapid development model is taking the content, taking the surveys, taking the data that you have, and as a designer, making really serious choices as to how to simplify a process, make it as easily understood as possible, and getting it out the door quickly to then get reactions. Right. So go back to your learners, go back to your business case that you're trying to solve, go back to your stakeholders that are invested in getting this solved, and ask the questions. Is this solving the problem?
Yeah, and I know when I've spoken to L&D professionals around a minimum viable kind of approach, often there's a misunderstanding that minimum viable product means shorter courses or doing less. Versus, I guess, how would you describe to someone what the difference is between an MVP versus, having your full-blown learning program or course or whatever the kind of full-blown version looks like? What's the difference there?
I'm going to give you a great story, and I'm sure that some of my former colleagues will, if they ever hear this, will chuckle. I was brought in to Savannah College of Art and Design, big art school here in Savannah, international program. And this is years ago, it's like 2005. They wanted to build an e-college, right? And this was really my first hit the ground running design thinking, minimal viable product practice that I had no idea, did not have words for at the time, right? That wasn't in our conception.
Yeah.
What we knew is that we were about 2 weeks ahead of the students in a number of courses. Yeah. We were developing full-blown courses, right? On that first level model. And getting them out the door in about 2 weeks ahead of a lot of the students who are going to be taking the course. So it didn't mean that the courses were incomplete. It didn't mean that the courses were not exceptionally well designed and well defined and beautiful and elegant in their conception. But what we were doing is getting them out the door to then get is this giving us the results that we're looking for?
Right.
But I think you're right. I mean, I think that MVP is can be another word for shoddy, and I don't send anything out shoddy,
Yeah. So once you've got that out, you're obviously collecting feedback. And at this point, how do you go about evaluating whether the MVP is actually moving you in the right direction?
Yeah, I think that questions that you get are probably your best barometer for your success.
Right.
So I'm thinking about this live training that I worked on a couple of years ago, which was going out to like hundreds of thousands of people, to up to 1 million. I think it ended up reaching about 1 million people. And the first thing that we did was listen to the questions and then reincorporated the questions into the training before we did the next 2 sessions, right? So are you still getting the questions?
Right.
Yeah.
These are questions about, like, this is still unanswered for me. So you think that bit of knowledge is missing? Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Fill the gap with the questions. Like, if somebody's willing to ask the question, where do I go to find this? Or if, then clearly I have not given them sufficient information,
Right.
or I've not said it the third time, or I've not shown it somewhere. So yeah, I love questions. That's usually where we end up, getting the quickest results to go back to the next thing. If we don't get the questions, then we start asking questions.
And what's your typical process for evaluating whether it's, you mentioned kind of solving the business problem? How do you gather data to understand whether you are solving the business problem or not?
And that's a much longer course usually, right? So MVP doesn't work there. We do need to look at things to see if the business, the needle moves in the business. And it might be, right now I'm working on a program where we're really trying to change onboarding from being 9 months to 90 days.
Right.
So like the time to project is much quicker. So people are not stuck in sort of a loop of learning, instead of, going on and doing lots of on the job training to get up to speed. So that's something that doesn't happen in a week. So I think that a lot of those same listening tools, like the engagement surveys, like the pulse surveys, like the NPS scores, those pieces end up showing us broadly organizationally, like if we're moving the needle with the employee experience, right? But project by project, I think the outcomes are largely, more measured in, less training time, or quicker to the job, or if you're working in an industrial space, lower incidence of any sort of adverse effect event happening. So the measures are different, and they certainly take place over the time. Have you had Nelson, you should talk to Kevin Yates. Have you talked to him
We've
yet?
had Kevin on the show. We have.
You have? Okay, I've got to go and take a look at that.
On our show. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just finished his L&D detective kit, and how eloquent it is in creating a design process for data, right? And data discovery. But I think that, I think L&D, this is I'm probably gonna get like bad tweets or something. I think L&D talks, we spend a lot of time talking about our data problems, right? Like, you hear this, you've done, you hear this all the time, the L&D data problems, right? But I start to wonder a lot if it's not like a learning and development professional business acumen problem, right?
Yeah.
Like, I had my own problems there. I went and got an MBA. Like, you can find the information, right?
Yeah.
And I think Kevin does a great job there too.
Absolutely. I mean, for our listeners, definitely go check out the episode with Kevin. It's all about data. And I think it's a valid point, Sarah. I think often what we miss is the skill to be data proficient, or at least comfortable with the idea of it. Is, we often compare it with the idea of, if you look at when I started my career in marketing was very much about the 4 Ps, and it was about being a creative, and the element of data was still kind of outsourced to a different team. But today, data is such an intrinsic part of the marketing role, and being able to leverage that data. And we're seeing the same shift in L&D, where you need to be comfortable with data. Not to say you need to be the absolute whiz in data, and you can absolutely bring in people who are dedicated in that skill, but you need to be comfortable enough to understand what the data is telling you, or to at least ask the right questions. And often I think that's the underrated skill, is asking the right questions from the data. The data can pretty much tell you whatever you want it to tell you. If you're asking the wrong questions, you're going to walk away with the wrong conclusions from it. Before we kind of
if you're not designing, if you're not designing for that data, like if you're not designing the program to track and create those data streams, to measure the pieces that you're really looking for. So if I'm looking for, taking 9 months to 90 days, clearly I'm looking for time metrics and time, time on site, time in program, time to completion, and then other pieces that relate to productivity, measures, and learning competency measures, and value of learning to job, time on job. Like, those measures are significant, right?
Yeah.
But they're all built within the design.
That's, I think, spot on, Sarah. It's built into the design, right? It isn't an afterthought. And I think this is often where what we see is you get what you measure, right? If, say, for example, you're trying to cut down your onboarding from 6 months to 3 months, if you're not measuring whether that time is changing, then you're not going to get it in your data, right? If all you're looking at is whether someone opened and completed the course that you designed, then when you report back, that's all you're going to have. And often, I think when people are talking about data problem, it goes beyond just making sense out of data. The problem is you didn't even have the instruments in place to measure that data in your design. And so the problem's probably a lot earlier on in the process, rather than afterwards going, I don't have the data. And before we go into the rapid fire section, Sarah, someone listening to this, they're excited by the idea of applying design thinking. Sarah's sold it to me. I want some of this design thinking stuff. Where do I start? If I wanted to do something this week, this month, to start me on that journey of kind of applying design thinking to L&D, where should I start?
Yeah, and I think, I spoke to the Luma Institute. I think that's a great starting place for learning and development professionals. I think it comes out of that human factors space, like really looking at how to solve business problems through the people that are part of it. And I think they've got some really great tools for that. Learning, there are some great books out there on design thinking, but a lot of them align to the software development space. It's not that you can't, reapply them. There is a new ADDIE book out on design thinking for instructional designers that I have on my things to read list. It's literally sitting on my nightstand right now. But I think that we are going to see this more and more over the next 5 years. We're not necessarily an industry that's quick to pick up methodologies. But I think we're going to see more and more, reading and research in that. I know that, Josh Person has a great program in his academy on design thinking for instructional design. So there are resources out there. I think there's actually a Harvard or a Cornell program on design thinking for innovation.
Right.
So there's stuff out there. It's not going to necessarily be related to learning.
And a bit biased here, but I've got my book coming out, which does cover design thinking, agile, and
yes.
so If you're interested in it, I basically adapted it for L&D. Check it out, Learning at Speed, out on the 3rd of June, and you can pre-order it now. Thought I'd use that opportunity, Sarah, since we're talking about a similar topic. But are you ready for the quickfire round?
I'm so ready. I'm so prepared for this. Let's do it.
Let's do this. How do you learn, Sarah?
Continuously. As a kid.
Around how you typically approach it?
As a kid, I had a near photographic memory, and then I spent a lot of time in art school, and I think that my vision has blurred as I've gotten older too. So having a photographic memory is great for bar trivia, but it's also great to be able to just read and absorb a lot of information.
Wow. What do you love most about your job?
People, and making an impact on people's lives and their job and their, goals and professional development. I mean, that's what gets me to show up every day.
How do you like to start your day?
I spend about 30 to 90 minutes reading every morning.
Oh, wow. If you could change one thing about L&D, what would it be?
That was the easiest of these questions. More 2D design practice. So I come out of an art school background and taught as an art professor for a dozen years. 2D design practice. If I ever write my book, Nelson, it'll be 2D design for instructional designers. I think that we skip over that in L&D, and I think that is the practice of design is essential.
I look forward to reading it, Sarah, when it's ready. What's the one bit of advice you give out the most?
Have only one story.
The book you've recommended the most?
Visual Grammar by Christian Laborg.
Right. Why do you recommend that book the most?
It goes back into that 2D design space. I mean, I think that he does a very elegant job of visualizing all of the elements and principles of design. And I think that anybody who works in the design space, I mean, we're constantly making these choices. So sometimes they're really tiny little choices, like what size font something should be, or what size something should be on a slide, or how much weight or color it should have on a slide. And I think Christian Laborg is a genius in really dissecting that in terms of the choices that we're making that we might not even be conscious of.
I think I'm going to add that to my wish list there.
That's great.
What do you know now that you wish you knew at the start of your career?
That this is where I was supposed to be.
Wow.
That I spent a lot of moments, questioning why I was doing different things and why it felt so hard. And part of that resilience is getting to where you're supposed to be.
What's your best productivity hack?
Insomnia. And smart. For many years, I thought that was my best productivity hack, but really it's smart sheets. I live and die by the smart sheets. I manage my whole team across smart sheets. I can't function without the ability to look at a Gantt chart.
What's the one thing you've changed your mind about recently?
Perfectionism.
Oh, what's your thinking around it now?
I'm chasing progress, not perfection this year.
And the last one for you, Sarah, today is, what are you most proud of?
My family. That's an easy one.
Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Nelson. I appreciate the time.
As someone who loves learning, I have to say, I found diving into design thinking for L&D super interesting. I've definitely added a few of those recommendations to my wish list. If you liked today's episode, please do subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And as always, you can find details for myself and Sarah in the description. See you next time.